Hello, I'm Cameo George, executive producer of American Experience, PBS's flagship and longest running history series. Thank you for joining us. Today's conversation is inspired in part by the PBS rebroadcast of our film Ruby Ridge, tomorrow, April 13th at 9 p.m. Eastern. This documentary tells the story of the ill-fated 1992 standoff between a family and federal agents in northern Idaho that would leave Randy Weaver injured, his wife and 14-year-old son dead, and some convinced that the federal government was out of control. We'll cover the events of Ruby Ridge and the subsequent rise of the far-right militia movement over the next 30 years, up through and including the Capitol Hill siege this past January. This is meant to be an interactive conversation. I invite you to write questions for our panelists and moderator in the chat box. We'll answer as many as possible during the discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge our corporate sponsors, Liberty Mutual Insurance and Consumer Cellular. I'd also like to acknowledge the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation, the Documentary Investment Group, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, PBS, our home station GBH, and of course, viewers like you. Now I'd like to introduce our panelists and moderator for this conversation. Barak Goodman is the writer, producer, and director of Ruby Ridge. He is co-founder of ARC Media. His films for ARC Media have been nominated for an Academy Award and won multiple Emmy, DuPont Columbia, and Peabody Awards. He's also won the RFK Journalism Prize and had several films chosen as official selections at the Sundance Film Festival. In addition to Ruby Ridge, his work for American Experience includes Oklahoma City, about the nation's deadliest domestic terror attack, Clinton, a 4-hour biography of former President Bill Clinton, and My Lai, the story of America's most notorious war crime. Jess Walter is the author of 9 books, including Ruby Ridge, The Truth and Tragedy of the Randy Weaver Family, Beautiful Ruins, a #1 New York Times bestseller, and The Zero, a finalist for the National Book Award. Our moderator, Adriane Lentz-Smith, is Associate Professor and Associate Chair at Duke's Department of History, where she teaches courses on the Civil Rights Movement, Black Lives, Modern America, and History in Fact and Fiction. She is author of Freedom Struggles, African Americans and World War I. Thank you again, and we hope you enjoy today's conversation.
Thanks to Cameo for that introduction. Good afternoon to all of y'all, and thank you for joining us for this conversation. Welcome, Barak. Welcome, Jess. I'm really excited to be with y'all today for a discussion about the rise of the modern American militia movement and beginning with the events at Ruby Ridge. Okay, I'm going to set the scene and then we'll jump into our conversation. Shortly before dawn on August 21st, 1992, 6 heavily armed U.S. Marshals made their way up to the isolated mountaintop home of Randy and Vicki Weaver and their children on Ruby Ridge in northern Idaho. Charged with selling 2 illegal sawed-off shotguns to an undercover agent, Weaver had failed to appear in court and law enforcement was tasked with bringing him in. For months, the Weavers had been holed up on their property with a cache of firearms, including automatic weapons. When the federal agent surveilling the property crossed paths with the members of the family, a firefight broke out. The standoff that mesmerized the nation would leave Weaver injured, his wife and son dead, and some convinced that the federal government was out of control. Okay, we're going to talk about the material in the documentary. We're going to talk about that history. But before we get to that, I actually want to go back and just talk a little bit about the origins of this film. So Barak, can you tell us a little bit about how this documentary came to be?
Sure. Thanks for having me and talking about this. We originally were going to and did make a film about the Oklahoma City bombing, Timothy McVeigh's act of domestic terrorism. And the film was really an effort to trace the root system that led to McVeigh's act. And very quickly, it became clear that that root system extended through this event. This event was one of the critical junctures for McVeigh and his conversion to radicalism. And we went out and reported this story. We met Jess Walter and other people who had been there in person, and we were absolutely enthralled by it. And we ended up being able to interview Sarah Weaver, who was the eldest daughter of Randy and Vicki, and lived through this in the cabin, and really was one of the most compelling interviews I've ever done. And when my boss, Mark Samuels, saw that interview and saw it in the context of our Oklahoma City film, he said, this really needs to be its own hour. So we spun it off like an old time sitcom or something. We spun off this hour on Ruby Ridge and kept part of the Ruby Ridge story in the Oklahoma City film, but have this standalone film solely about this really seminal event in the history of the rise of the militia movement.
And you say it's a seminal event, or that the root system runs through Ruby Ridge. Why?
You know, a lot of movements, all movements, they need their founding myths. They need the narrative to be proved by real world events. And this event, in many ways, lives out the most extreme paranoid fantasies of the far right. It is an innocent family in their home in the wilderness, and descend the forces of evil, the federal government, to, in their minds, in their worldview, to impinge on their rights, to take away their guns, to force them to live conventionally. And so it had the trappings of exactly the kind of fevered, sort of nightmare scenarios that they traffic in. And the FBI has since acknowledged that it terribly mishandled this. In many ways, it fulfilled the prophecies of the far right. And you saw that at the base of this mountain in Ruby Ridge, where for the first time, elements of across the spectrum of far right descend on this place and begin to talk to each other and begin to compare notes. And really, this is the seed, for what came after, which is the sprouting of this militia movement that ultimately leads to McVeigh and ultimately leads to the insurrection we just saw. So it is not the only origin for this. There are multiple points, but it is one of the seminal moments.
And Jess, you were standing at the base of this mountain when this was unfolding. Do you see a similar, to stand there in the moment is one thing, to look back on it with hindsight is another, but do you see a similar kind of link between the various kind of what we might otherwise think of as isolated outcroppings of far right terrorism?
Yeah, I think definitely in many ways. Some of it is a recycling. Some of QAnon is a recycling of some of these, some of the same conspiracy theories. The Illuminati, for instance, shows up in both. So I definitely think you see the tendrils stretching back to this moment. And I think Barak is exactly right in that this is a sort of origin story for people who feel aggrieved by the government. And then I think also you see, because this occurred in such a remote place, I think unlike Waco, this wasn't as well known. And people talk about it all the time without really understanding its complexity. It's a story of law enforcement overstepping its bounds. It has as much in common with what happened to the American Indian movement and Black Panther Party as it does a founding right-wing myth. But it has certainly taken that place in the culture.
It's complicated, right? Because again, it's the difference between being an analyst or an observer and a participant. We can see what it has in common with what happens with AIM or what happens with the Black Panther Party and COINTELPRO. Getting other folks there, I'm curious about the mistrust of the government that fuels this and how people are able to divorce that from their own kind of racial views, or they're like how people are unable to do likening of kind of people in their humanity, even as they're having similar responses to state power. That said, I wonder if we shouldn't play the clip that talks a little bit about folks and their motivations, and then come back and go through that and their beliefs back into this conversation about the kind of the racism part that is actually distinct from, but hard to disimplicate from, the mistrust of state power part.
Sure.
So let's cue the documentary clip, please.
These are people that want to be left alone. And Randy's arrest just galvanized the Uyghurs' hatred of the federal government. They really thought the government was evil. Vicky wrote 2 letters to the U.S. Attorney for Idaho, which she addressed to the servants of the Queen of Babylon.
The Queen of Babylon. This is very much the language that was coming out of the Aryan nations. This language of a coming war with the Anglo-Saxon armies defeating the tyrant that was the federal government. She believed not only that we were living in the end times, but that she was being given signs. And she was defiant.
I think she was at the end of her rope. I really do. And I think for Mom and Dad, it was, we're not going to take anymore. You know, getting thrown in the snow and sent to jail, and if you lose your case, you lose your house. They had to have been an emotional mess.
And then Randy doesn't show up for trial. What happened next was the brutality of bureaucracy. One agency leads to another agency. So the case becomes the responsibility of the U.S. Marshals Service.
Our job was to bring him before the court to answer charges. And that's all it is. It doesn't even necessarily mean he's guilty of anything. Our first step was to do a threat assessment. He didn't appear like he was going to run or abscond in some way. He had roots in the community, he had a family there, and I thought that time was on our side. But that threat assessment also showed that he was extremely committed to his cause. And that's what made that situation a little more dangerous.
The threat assessment portrayed Randy Weaver as a former Special Forces Green Beret who may have booby-trapped his house, living with a woman who would kill her own children rather than surrender. It was either worst-case scenario or fanciful, but the assessment of the Weavers made them look more like criminals and less like a family.
So will both of you help us understand a little bit who these actors are and what motivates them?
Boy, that's such a large, wide question. You have such a broad swath of the radical right, and I think for me one of the most alarming things is the way so much of that rhetoric has been swept into the mainstream of the Republican Party, and so I think that changes over time. During Ruby Ridge, you're talking about a much narrower band of people who are talking about in these anti-government ways, who are reaching for conspiracy theory to explain, various things. I do think there is a strain of racism that runs through so much of it, and that I think has also been mainstreamed in the past few years. But really, I think that to me is the big difference between 25, 30 years ago and right now, the way so much of this has been mainstreamed into the way people might talk on that someone on Fox News might speak the way people at the roadblock at Ruby Ridge did almost 30 years ago.
I agree with Jess. I do think there is a range, but I do think there are elements to these radical views that rhyme with each other, that have some resonance with each other. I think Timothy McVeigh was paranoid about guns specifically. The Branch Davidians were, of course, millennial apocalyptic sect of Christianity who also were concerned with guns, but also were concerned with a kind of, a government that was run by Jews and by a one world conspiracy that was bent on infringing on their religious rights. But what they have in common in the Weavers and Back to the Order and Robert Matthews, what they have in common is a sense of aggrievement, a sense that the modern world is laying siege to them and to their sort of rightful place, their superior rightful place. Absolutely, racism and anti-Semitism is shot through all of these movements. Now today, they've learned to dress themselves up a little bit. They're a little bit less overtly racist and anti-Semitic. Some of them aren't. But at bottom is the sense of deep insecurity and deep aggrievement at the ways in which they're being supplanted. We just heard Tucker Carlson, speaking of mainstreaming this, talk about being replaced on Fox News. This was just a few days ago, using that language of replacement. And I think that's hugely important to the psychology of many of these right-wing groups, the sense that they are being replaced. They have no other options but to fight back in the ways in which they're doing.
There are ways in which that's really, that it's, we see our contemporary version of it, but there are iterations of that in the late 19th century as people are feeling dislocated by the rise of industrial capitalism. We certainly hear it in the mid 20th century as various movements threaten people's sense of the world. We talk about this being mainstreamed, but in some ways, when I think of an articulated mistrust of the government, I think of the rhetoric that Reagan, that brought Reagan to victory in 1980, right? The government is the problem was not simply the language of the fringe.
And I think, you take that all the way forward to January 6th. And, I felt like there had to have been some Republican members of Congress who felt like they had been sawing on the branch that they were sitting on for years. You cannot demonize government in that way. That one of the reasons that I called the original version of my book "Every Knee Shall Bow" was this idea that this unbending belief that the Weavers had that the government was out to get them. And of course, when you believe the government's out to get you, and then you have what happens at Ruby Ridge, this series of bureaucratic movements in which the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Farms hands it off to the Marshal Service, hands it off to the FBI. It really is a dehumanizing process that ended up, with the deaths of, with the totally unnecessary deaths of all these people. And so, I do think that that movement we've had, which has been to demonize government, is a mirror of the movement that, in a way, demonizes the Weavers, demonizes, a member of Antifa who was shot without warning, apparently. I think, again, I think this often goes back to law enforcement and to the way law enforcement has and hasn't been supervised and regulated in this country. And so the details of the case are used in a certain way, but that doesn't change, I don't think, the complexity of what this story is.
So there's what happened, and there's the meaning that people have made out of what happened, right? There's the meanings we can kind of excavate, but then there's also the meanings that are imposed on it.
Yeah, definitely. And do those fall on racial lines? Do they fall? Yeah, definitely. They fall, within sort of the guns, the founding myths of the West too, a kind of individualism, gun rights and gun ownership. There was a moment in the trial I'll never forget in which that mainstreaming of this really became clear. The FBI brought out all of the weapons that the Weavers owned. So there are all these guns on a giant pegboard. And it was really, it looked like they were preparing an army. And Jerry Spence, knowing he had an Idaho jury, walked up and took those rifles off and handed them through the jury box. And to watch the prosecutors as these jurors just sighted through rifles, because they had those in their own trucks in their own houses. It immediately changed this from the Weavers being a white supremacist army to being a family in the woods. The measure of a real intellect being able to hold two opposing thoughts, it neither absolves the Weavers of their responsibility, nor does it absolve the government of the mistreatment of and the flaws in this case.
I agree with you about, in this case, it was clear that the FBI was far exceeded its rightful authority, but it becomes much grayer as you progress along this chain and you get to Waco, for example, where of course everybody remembers there was a 51-day standoff, and there were the very same hostage negotiators that were at Ruby Ridge were brought to Waco to deal with that problem. And as a journalist and as a filmmaker, it was really hard to know what tone to adopt in that story, because while of course we know the outcome was awful and horrendous and resulted in the deaths of scores of people, it was very hard to know what you would have done differently. How were they supposed to sit there and do nothing for weeks upon weeks upon weeks when there were rampant rumors that David Koresh was abusing children in there, where there was lots of firsthand testimony that there was a suicide pact? It's very easy, my point is, to look in retrospect and hindsight and to say to law enforcement, you should have, must have, messed up here. At the time, it's much harder. Not so much in Ruby Ridge, but certainly in Waco. And now we see all the way to the insurrection where the criticism is leveled that they didn't do anything. So you're sort of damned if you do and damned if you don't when you're in this situation where there's a barricade, there's some kind of either a mob situation or a barricade situation. It's very difficult to know what to do as law enforcement.
And we had talked about this before, what the FBI ended up terming Weaver fever, which was avoid these situations where someone is, the prophecy is that the government's going to come get you. If you go get them, you could end up in a firefight. You could end up with people dead over a small gun violation or over these other things. And, after that, the way the Freeman standoff was treated, the way the Bundys were treated after taking over the wildlife refuge in Oregon. And then I think probably the most, in some ways, outrageous case is John Joe Gray in Texas, who had a 15-year standoff with federal law enforcement, would not leave his house, and basically put himself under arrest for 15 years. For a charge that probably would have gotten him 6 months, but rather than bend his knee to the federal government. And so does government learn a lesson? Yes, but then that brings up the other question, is it applied equally? For people of color, for Black Lives Matter protesters to watch the kid gloves with which sometimes these cases are handled has to be infuriating, because it looks again like two different kinds of justice being practiced.
Well, I think even in Ruby Ridge, kind of watching the debacle that was the FBI response. I mean, one of my first thoughts was that it probably wouldn't have been Black people at the top of a northern Idaho ridge, but had it been, it would have been a lot bloodier, a lot sooner.
Move in Philadelphia.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Move in Philadelphia. Fred Hampton, who hadn't done anything in Chicago, hadn't done anything but actually produced the kind of political alliances that we just said were hard to imagine being possible. Perhaps this is a good time actually to cue up the second clip so that folks in the audience can see the choices that law enforcement made in handling this, and then we'll come back and continue this conversation.
If we can have your attention for a few moments, we can give you an update.
Once a day or so, their special agent in charge would come down and hold a a pretty feeble press conference.
Do you consider this overkill to get two fugitives, all these people?
No, I don't. I don't at all. This is a complicated situation because in the residence, there are juveniles. That's a critical factor that sometimes in our busy society we tend to overlook. That's a critical factor. And in our society, we place a high value on a human life.
At this point, they don't know Vicki Weaver's dead. The hostage negotiators would begin every morning by saying, Vicki, send the children out, we're having pancakes. Vicki, why won't you come talk to us? We won't harm you. Inside the cabin where Vicki is lying dead, the family believes they're taunting them.
My dad, he lost it. And he started to yell at him, and I wanted him to stay quiet. I was scared to death that they would find out his location and just open up on him. But he's like, you shot my wife, you cowardly SOBs.
The negotiations were addressed to Vicki because we thought she was very influential towards Randy, and we thought that she was very strong as a personality and that she would be very helpful. Little did we know that she had been killed, and that she was he was incredibly offended by any mention of his wife who's laying in the kitchen. It was awful. It was awful.
In his mind, we had proven everything that he felt and believed and been taught to believe about the federal government was true, and that it was coming true piece by piece.
So y'all make the point through the documentary that the question of who's to blame is perhaps not the most compelling question, but more what led to this and then what are the consequences of it. We've talked a little bit about that, but can we talk a little more about just what really seems like bad decision-making on both sides and what that ends up producing?
Yeah, I think it really is an object lesson in a kind of dehumanization on both sides. I think the story of the Weaver family, if you follow their radicalization, you come to understand how a conspiracy theory begins to supplant any kind of real judgment or interaction with other people, interaction with the government. The government becomes a kind of entity, a sort of evil force, malevolent force. And the simplest thing, Randy Weaver, this all started because Randy Weaver failed to show up for a very minor summons. And something so small could trigger this sort of psychology where he would inflate it into a kind of Manichaean us versus them kind of scenario. And similarly on the other side, I think the FBI, they lost a member of law enforcement. One of the marshals was killed, and I think that triggered an immediate overreaction, an immediate feeling that this was a dangerous, radical, terrorist entity, when it was really, as Jess said, a family that had gotten lost. And I think the FBI has since acknowledged that it would have handled things much differently now. But at the time, this kind of psychology takes hold and there is no real interaction between the two, and you end up with a tragedy like this.
I think to go back another step before not showing up for court is something that a lot of defendants in drug cases would recognize, which is an informant gets Randy Weaver to saw the barrels off some shotguns and sell them to him. He was not dealing in shotguns. It was very much to get information to get inside the Aryan nations. And rightly so, the Aryan nations at the time was committing bombings and murders throughout the country. Various members of splinter groups were. And so that you know, I think Randy Weaver gets swept up in an investigation that is beyond him. When he refuses to cooperate, it's, you know, you see all these places where the train can get off the tracks, and it just never does. It goes, you know, instead now he becomes a federal fugitive. Now it's passed off to the Marshal Service. There's so many compelling interviews, some of which, you know, in our reporting and in my book we had, and then others which I hadn't seen before. And one of them is Dave Hunt, the US Marshal, saying we didn't care if he was guilty or innocent, we just had to bring him in. And when it moves from one agency to another, the FBI agents, Christopher Whitcomb, we didn't know what we had, we just had this. And that the competitive level of those agencies and the way they had become almost like paramilitary organizations themselves. We talk a lot about the guns on the radical right, and that is a huge part of that culture. It's also part of the culture that tried to bring the Weavers in. You know, the special operations group, the hostage rescue team. These agencies have become incredibly militarized, in part to face against organizations and groups that were incredibly militarized. But you build up these, you know, this sort of weaponry on both sides, and you know, this is the end result in a way.
Yeah, there's a striking disaggregation in some ways, right? So it's, I mean, on the one hand, you have people who are fantasizing about the government as this kind of nebulous unitary cabal. But then what you're telling is a story of different agencies with different personalities and different inclinations, but all of whom suddenly have a truckload of guns, right? So the militarized, but distinct from one another. And then on the law enforcement side, it's this fusion of far-right groups. When, I mean, part of the story that it seems to me that Susan Weaver is insisting on is that her family they're not deeply invested in kind of white, Aryan, what have you. They might articulate with it, but that's not their cause particularly, right?
I mean, I think it comes down to the difference between belief and actions. Right. The Weavers' beliefs were abhorrent, and I think it's, to me, this documentary really ends, and people watch it with an incredible grace note, and the wisdom comes from Sarah Weaver when she gives a warning about what happens when you operate out of misinformation and fear. Yeah. And we just had an entire attempted takeover of Congress out of misinformation and fear, and so I think those, you know, what we do with information is so incredibly important, and for those Weaver children to be raised with their misinformation is a tragedy and a crime in itself, and to see Sarah Weaver, I think, realize some of that. You know, and is pretty moving.
I'm really glad, Jesse, you mentioned that, because I want to say something about Sarah Weaver. You know, she is the heart and soul and the conscience of this film, and I don't think we certainly wouldn't have made it without her. But I think that she is really, to me, the antidote and the sort of hope that comes out of this story, because as Jess pointed out, she is someone who could easily have been. She was traumatized beyond what any of us can imagine, being in that house, seeing her mother shot, her brother killed. But it chose, instead of being bitter, she's chosen to use this experience to de-escalate and to teach, not only teach people like her, but teach law enforcement how maybe to react better in future situations. So she somehow has come back from that extreme experience, which could have permanently embittered her, to a place of love. And I think, you know, again, it was definitely one of the most compelling interviews I've ever done in my career. And I think she's one of the most extraordinary people I've ever met in my career. And I even though I don't agree with her in many ways politically, she is someone who I just admire, and really is the reason this film was made.
Yeah, I think one of the things I found, having, you know, covered it almost 30 years ago and then writing about it, is people will come up to me and it's like a Rorschach test. They're looking at the same ink blot, but they describe something entirely different. This is what happens when, when a white supremacist takes to the mountains. This is what happens when the government's out of control. And the people's willingness to exclude part of the information, to only take those details. I can still remember some people describing Randy Weaver as a gentleman farmer, like he's up tending crops and ignoring the fact that, that he's wearing swastikas and, sending out letters to the, to the U.S. Marshals Service. It really does beg for complexity and for information and for knowledge, and to hear, as you said, if it would be understandable for anyone to believe in these conspiracies and in government versus the poor people, it would be Sarah Weaver. And to hear her make that plea for, to not operate out of misinformation and fear, I think it is a moment of hope.
I'm going to ask you all a question that we've actually talked through already, but I'm going to ask you to put a fine point on it. And on the subject of misinformation and the way that it motivates people and the urgency of something clearer. Having witnessed, studied, read about, thought about Ruby Ridge and Waco and Oklahoma City, and perhaps Charlottesville, were you surprised by the storming of the Capitol in January? And what do you think led us to that? Led them. I'm not actually going to say us. Like, what got folks there to that?
Well, I think most people know the answer to that question. I mean, the interesting thing to me is, after Oklahoma City, a lot of these militia groups, far-right groups, went underground. They went to ground. Southern Poverty Law Center, which tracks this, saw a huge decrease in activity. But of course, we know throughout American history, as you pointed out, these tropes, these manners of thinking don't go away. They may go dormant, but it took a combination of a president willing to mainstream these ideas, a big media operation willing to mainstream, for these folks to feel that they were being summoned in some way, literally, to come out of whatever kind of self-imposed hiding they were in, and to express explicitly their views, and in fact to act them out. And I think what strikes me about the insurrection is probably those people were surprised that they were resisted as much as they were, which was almost nothing. They viewed this as their play, their house, their country, their capital, and probably felt they could walk right in there. And I mean, this is how emboldened they've become. They don't view themselves as being outside the mainstream. They view everyone else as being outside the mainstream. And so I'm not at all surprised at what happened. I am somewhat surprised at the lack of law enforcement resistance, given the history here. But even that's explainable. But when you have a president over and over and over again pressing that button, it's absolutely surprising that didn't happen earlier, frankly.
Yeah, I don't think you can lay the blame anywhere but, at the feet of the person who spoke and, who rallied that crowd. I think the question of mainstreaming of these views is a really fascinating one. And you're absolutely right about what happened after Oklahoma City. That was a step too far. Those same politicians who got elected mostly in the South and the rural West through anti-government rhetoric really put the brakes on that anti-government rhetoric. You did not hear them, with that same level. And when it arose again in the campaign of Donald Trump, it was not as a dog whistle. It was not in the background. It was very much in the foreground, and it was used in the language of resentment and of the white working class losing some ground, and the anti-immigrant language of the early 1900s, Reagan's "Make America Great Again." It was really a recycled greatest hits through through the P.T. Barnum of our time, and the Republican Party is lashed to it still, and willingly, it seems. So yeah, I think I think this differs from what happened in the 90s because it comes from the top. This is not bubbling up from these groups. It's Donald Trump retweeting QAnon posts. It very much is in many ways far more alarming because of the official face behind it.
I remember that one of the striking things about when I did the Oklahoma City film was that Timothy McVeigh really believed that after the bombing of the Oklahoma City Murrah building, that there would be an outpouring of sort of a new revolutionary war would be triggered by this, and he would be considered, a great figure in history. And it didn't happen, but it is kind of happening now. I won't say that the current crop is, directly lionizing McVeigh and the Oklahoma City bombing, but it's not that far off. And I think he wasn't wrong in the sense that he understood how widespread these views were, and that the bombing was a step too far, but the ideas that underlay the bombing, this sort of anti-government, pro-gun paranoia, he was very, very accurate in how he felt that it was extremely widespread, and now we're seeing it. It's been mainstreamed.
This might actually be a good transition to our questions, which are coming in, because the first one is about the Turner Diaries, which I know also was influential on McVeigh. This question asks, is there a backstory of the Turner Diaries and how it basically revitalizes white supremacist militia group movements in the 1980s and 1990s?
Yeah, it shows up like a bad penny. It turns up in these cases, and almost its suppression proves its provenance to people. The fact that they didn't hear of it, and here it is. The Turner Diaries is a 50-year-old novel that portends the coming race war, and is the motivation behind so many of these things. I haven't seen it I haven't looked for it, but I haven't seen it in QAnon conspiracy. I haven't seen it in iterations now, but it has never ceased to go away. It's always been part of this motivation.
In fact, Timothy McVeigh based his bomb on the description in the Turner Diaries of the bombing of the FBI building. So it's very directly a template for a lot of these groups.
So the next question asks us, when law enforcement or the government acts in these tragic situations, there is a distinction between exercising restraint and taking sides. How do you see this distinction both then and now?
We were talking before about the, what Black Lives Matter protesters must think watching, kid gloves used in some of these cases. And I saw this great tweet that basically said, we don't want you to shoot them, we just want you to not shoot us. And I think that, that sense, how many ex-law enforcement members or current law enforcement members were part of the group that stormed the Capitol. I think that the military and law enforcement, have some measure of responsibility in policing some of these things, because there is a little bit of crossover, not a lot, but there's enough that for it to be alarming.
I was really struck. This always happens to me. I'm like, I need new lenses because I have to squint. I was really struck by how the news media got further ahead of the facts in reporting this story meaning Ruby Ridge, and how that amplified the tragedy and the distrust of news organizations. Do you think this changed journalist responsibilities, and do you think it should have?
I can almost only answer that personally because I know my view of the case changed as we covered it. We had covered in the Northwest so many terrorist groups with links to the Aryan nations. And so we had a sort of template for how to cover these things. And it wasn't until I began talking to Randy Weaver's family and they described a very different situation. And then, meeting with Sarah Weaver the day after the standoff ended and hearing her version of what the family had gone through, that I had to step back and look differently at the way I had written about it. I think it's a very difficult job being a daily reporter. You take what information the cops give you, you go write it. If someone will talk to you, you take that information, but you are really piecing through history. And I worry very much about what's happened to local journalism. My newspaper is 1/4 the size it was when we covered this case. We could not cover the case the way we do now. We would take the police press release and that would be it. And so in many ways, we're in worse case. We're in a worse position as a public to know these things because the people whose job it is, and reporters do an imperfect job, but the people whose job it is, they don't have those resources anymore.
And of course, nowadays, the coverage of anything like this would immediately sort of be placed in one of the two ecosystems. It would either be seen one way in the left-wing mainstream press and another in the right-wing, media ecosphere. So it's very hard to parse and to find truth, whatever truth is in coverage nowadays.
And it would go straight to social media. It would be the opinions would precede the facts.
Right. And it often takes months or even years to see something like this with any kind of objectivity. So I appreciate that question. The media is definitely part of this story and part of the way in which this narrative unfolds, and always in any of these kinds of confrontations.
What do we know about how the government tracks these groups today? Does the crackdown by Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube in recent months make it harder to know what groups are up to?
Well, I can help with that. I mean, fortunately, there is a really good surveillance network. I wouldn't say it exists in the FBI, but it also exists outside of law enforcement, with groups like the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Anti-Defamation League, and others who are tracking these groups very closely. It's a hugely important function they're performing. They've even infiltrated these groups with undercover informants in some cases, at great danger to themselves. So those groups need a shout out because they're keeping us all informed of the level. And they frankly have been sounding the alarm in the last few years. Really ever since Barack Obama was elected president, these groups have become more active, and therefore the alarms about these groups have become, much more urgent. And I do think that the FBI, at least law enforcement, is aware and tracking and has publicly stated that far right-wing terrorism is a vital threat, probably more so than foreign terrorism at this point. So there is some kind of eyes on what's going on. That's not to say that these kinds of attacks can be stopped altogether, because they're just too difficult to stop altogether. They're too easy to execute. So, but I think there's an awareness, let's put it that way.
And I think it's shifted since the last administration, which sort of went out of its way to look at left-wing agitators and activists more so than groups like the Oath Keepers. So it's hard to tell down. I know actual agents working in the field, try to avoid that sort of politics. Try to avoid being affected by which party is running the White House and the Justice Department. So we may not know for years whether or not that trickled down to field agents.
It's kind of interesting to think about the parallels between field agents and on the ground local reporters, right? Again, like we're amassing the information, we're building the overall knowledge. And as you scale up, like someday someone will get to spin or to, the political implications of choosing one prosecution or another, but we have to have the evidence, the data, the story, the info, as much as fully and roundly as possible.
Well, and for years after 9/11, of course, the real threat was seen as international terrorism. And so domestic terrorism, I think, got a shorter, certainly got less investigative attention, less money, less focus. So I do think that, I mean, again, it's hard to know exactly what's happening on the ground level of those agencies, but I do think since January 6th especially, it's getting a lot more attention.
Right, a reallocation of resources, as it were. This audience member asks us, what role might confirmation bias have had in these events? And that's interesting because I actually don't know if it's on whose part we're talking about the confirmation bias, but you could imagine.
I was just going to answer yes.
What I was trying to say earlier. I think that's really well put. That both sides are having their biases confirmed by the actions of the other, and that's the problem. They neither are able to see the other for who they are or should be. They're fitting into a sort of predetermined rubric, and I think that explains a lot of what happened at Ruby Ridge and Waco, both of them.
I mean, in some ways, we're asking everyone to do what the two of you do as writers and filmmakers, which is to, as fully as you can, imagine the humanity of the people who are not you, right? The people that you may disagree with, the people that you may be opposed to. I always quote Barbara Fields, who's a great historian, who wrote once that taking slaveholders seriously does not mean taking them literally. But she still says you have to take them seriously, right? You have to understand what they're saying, how they're saying it, and why they're saying it, in order then to analyze and kind of make your understanding from there. And in some ways, it's a similar practice when you're dealing with your antagonists or anyone around you.
This is Sarah Weaver's message. It's empathy. It's looking at your opponent or your enemy as a human being. And I think that's what she's trying to say at the end of our film. And I do think that's what we as journalists and filmmakers, writers should be doing. Sometimes don't do sufficiently well, but I think it's that effort to understand and not to paint in simple black and white terms. It's certainly what we try to do in this film, is to understand both sides, the psychology of both sides, to hear from the people themselves what they were thinking, and to try to analyze and find out where the disjuncture happened.
I think for me, one of the most demoralizing things over the years has been, I really sort of imagined that if I laid the case out in all of its detail, that most people would come to a similar conclusion. But in the 25 years since I wrote this book and the 30 years since the case, I feel like our agreement on basic facts has become so fractured. And to not, to be able to come to common agreement on things when we can't agree on the most basic facts, on science, on that, for me, that's been a really demoralizing thing. And I have really hoped that the January 6th insurrection attempt is a little bit like that moment of Oklahoma City, that it will cause politicians to ask if their rhetoric, if their willful ignorance, if their willful rejection of facts and details matters. And I hope it does. I mean, I hope that it is a turning point toward more understanding in that way. But it's alarming to look at that ink blot and see, to see two very different things.
Right. I think this is a good closing question. How did the community of Ruby Ridge or Spokane move forward after the 1992 siege?
You know, it's interesting. It did not become national news really until after Waco and then really after Oklahoma City. It was a time when things still could be sort of regional. So it was on the news and then it sort of disappeared. It did not really disappear here. I think, I think the trial followed through what happened and, at the standoff itself. And of course, Weaver and his family were found not guilty of everything except failure to show up in court. Even the original weapons charge was found by the jury to be entrapment. Later, the government settled for $3.1 million with the family. If you go now to those places in North Idaho that were sort of these moments of radical right-wing politics, the Aryan Nations compound is now owned by a human rights organization that sued them. There's a winery at Ruby Ridge. Sandpoint is probably one of the, is a place that people flock to ski. And, I think North Idaho sort of got a bad rap because of this one group being there. And I think in the Northwest, it's a much more accepting place than certainly it was before. I think we've found this fissure between urban and rural in the United States that has taken the place of some of these regional things, and between the Mason-Dixon line, which we've never settled, the North and the South. This is, I think this is a much deeper battle than what happened in the woods in North Idaho.
Barak, or was that a good?
No, I am not. I agree. I'm not an expert on that part of the world, although I was up on that mountain, and that mountain in particular hasn't changed. In fact, you can still see the ruins of the cabin. And one of the most profound experiences I had was we went up with Sarah up to the site of the cabin, and on the way up on these little ATVs, we passed by a kind of garbage dump which contained. She jumped off and she started to cry. There were her brother's backpack and shoes and stuff that they had left there still after all these years was still there, and was really moving to her. So things change, things stay the same. These groups are still out there. These people are still out there. They move. They're not located in any one part of the country. They're actually now coming into cities, and it's not so much geographic, as Jess says. It's really ideological, and it's really about a way of thinking, and that hasn't changed really since this period. In fact, as we've said, it's gotten more inflamed and wider spread, and it is a very alarming moment in the history of this country. And we'll see, but I would not be surprised if we start to see more of these kinds of attacks happening.
Yeah. Well, I guess we'll end on that note, y'all. But also, yes, I think that's right. Again, to go back to the note of grace, that there is something, it sounds very froofy, but I do think that compassion, empathy, a will to know that is rooted in evidence and not in feeling, in truth rather than truthiness, does do work, and we have to hold on to that and disseminate it as much as we can. But thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the art that you both put in the world. And with that, I am going to turn the screen back over to Cameo George. Thank you all for being here with us.
Thanks, Adriane.
Thank you for joining us today for this important and timely conversation. Ruby Ridge will air tomorrow night on PBS at 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Central, and will be available to stream in full on AmericanExperience.org and our YouTube channel. following Ruby Ridge, please do not miss American Insurrection, a new film by Frontline in partnership with ProPublica, investigating the rising threat of far-right violence in America, premiering at 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central. You can watch any of our virtual conversations anytime on our YouTube channel or on our website. Please go ahead and hit subscribe on our YouTube channel and sign up for our events newsletter to keep up with all of our virtual conversations. Thank you again. Have a wonderful evening.